So I'd like to, thank you all for coming and thank Dr. I'm not sure how you pronounce your surname, Gadot or
Gadot is good.
Okay, for coming and sharing her thoughts with us. I think John can give some introduction to you and say something about the book that your chapter is in.
Well, yes. Well, thank you, Shlomit, for coming. This is to highlight her work in this Psychoanalysis in the Mind-Body book that was published, and also that recently I found out it won the Gradiva Award for the best edited book. So that was a nice little bonus, and it's people like Shlomit who have made that possible. Our speaker today, for those of you who don't know her, is a clinical psychologist and a psychoanalyst and teacher in the Tel Aviv Institute for Contemporary Psychoanalysis. She also teaches and supervises in the interdisciplinary study program of the humanities faculty and in the doctoral and psychotherapy tracks in the School of Psychotherapy at Slackler School of Medicine at Tel Aviv University. She's a member of the board of directors of the International Association for Relational Psychoanalysis and writes and lectures on Freud, Lacan, and truth, integrating perspectives of psychoanalysis, philosophy, and cultural studies. Her book, Truth Matters, Theory and Practice in Psychoanalysis, was published by Brill in my book series in 2016. And she lives and practices in, I'm not even going to pronounce this correctly, Shlomit. So is it Ramat Chardon?
Ramat Sharon, yeah.
Okay. I'm embarrassed, but you'll forgive me. So I'm very pleased, and I have made many good friends in Israel, and I'm certainly hoping everything's going to turn out on a positive note for the country that I value. So I will now shut up, and I will turn this over to our guest speaker. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, John, for the introduction, and thank you for including me in this really ambitious and exciting project. My chapter in the book deals with my understanding of the mind-body question in Lacanian thought. And in the seminar today, I will touch upon the roots of the incipient mind as I understand it in this context of Lacanian thought. And then I'll try to elaborate on the mind-body connection as it manifests both in development and in analysis. But like in most psychoanalytic contexts, I'll begin with the Freudian connection before moving on to talk about Lacan. Lacan was a self-proclaimed Freudian, but effectually he reformulated both Freudian theory and the many Freudian concepts that he retained and employed. And he was determined to loosen the anatomical underpinnings of the psychoanalytic subject and actually to adjust the psychoanalytic concepts to the postmodern zeitgeist and the ethos of the linguistic turn, which was the atmosphere that he grew up in when he was a writer. Now, this transition had to be tackled from ideas that concern the very grassroots of human existence. And for Freud, those grassroots were given in the drive, in the concept of the drive. The drive is a sort of intermediary construct. It's a sort of theoretical tissue that connects body and mind and explains motivation, representation, and the gradual development of the mind in one theoretical framework. And I think that many of the mind-body questions are actually encapsulated within the notion of the drive and are really easier to tackle when we take it as an axiomatic given and innate connection of organism and representation. Because the coordination of the psychic and the physiological is actually already given in the construct of the drive. And the tripartite structure of the psyche is created as the drive develops and unfolds in predetermined ways, and it's orchestrated in the context of the reality principle and the pleasure principle and under society's prohibitions. And actually, the whole Freudian theory hinges on the body-based drive. Now, Lacan retains the basic idea of the drive, but he reformulates it in a very dramatic way. The Lacanian drive is independent of the body, and instead he conceived of the drive as a fabric of connections and disconnections with another in a way that I will try to explain now. Lacanian mental life actually begins with a cut from the other, the primal other, the very primal other, actually the mother. It's the separation from the mother at birth that for Lacan creates the life drive. This is not a body-based drive in Lacanian thought, but it's rather an energy that is born of an absence. And I will begin with a citation that I will read to you that Lacan wrote in Seminar 11. I'll read it and then I will explain it. He wrote, "I'm going to talk to you about the lamella. Whenever the membranes of the egg in which the fetus emerges on its way to becoming a newborn are broken, imagine for a moment that something flies off, this lamella, this organ, whose characteristic is not to exist, but which is nevertheless an organ, is the libido. It is the libido, qua pure life instinct, immortal life, irrepressible life. Precisely what is subtracted from the living being by virtue of the fact that it is subject to the cycle of sex reproduction. It is simplified, indestructible life, precisely that part that the individual loses at birth and which may serve to symbolize the most profound lost object." So what you can see from this short passage that I read, that when the child is born, something is lost. And this thing that is lost is actually the thing that Lacan calls the life drive. So the Lacanian life force, it is a negativity. It's a presence that represents loss. Now, this articulation of a presence standing in for an absence is at the heart of Lacanian thought and also of semiotics, if we think about it, because if we think what's a sign, it's something that stands in for something that is not there. Okay, if I say bottle, so I'm giving a sign for something that is not there. For Lacan, the subject himself is a sort of an absence, a sort of enclosed emptiness. He's born into a reality of loss, and this reality of loss and lack is what actually defines him. And his motivations during his life derive from a basic fantasy of re-achieving a state of wholeness that existed before he was born. And you can think of the whole corpus of Lacanian thought as a sort of a relational ontology of absence in a way. And it involves the it involves articulating absence as performed and materialized through relations and objects. And most importantly, this absence is an agency of sorts. It acts, it does things. And the phenomena, the manifestation, the experiential manifestation of this absence is actually Lacanian desire. It's an emptiness that propels, that creates trajectories and goals and velocities. It can be spatially located and materialized in any form that brings the lost presence to mind. A mark, a memorial, a sign, or an object. Now, developmentally, what predated this lack, this emptiness, was a mythic state of jouissance, where jouissance is some sort of an intense pleasure bordering on pain, that existed when the pre-subject was a fetus in the womb. And when you think about a fetus in the womb, then he's neither quite dead or alive, and he lacks nothing. He receives oxygen, nutrition, sensation via the mother's body. And this past mythic lack of a lack becomes the object of desire. And it's a desire that propels the subject to seek what he lost and what he will never refine while he lives. And the existence with, or rather within, the maternal thing is mythically remembered retroactively as a blissful, endless jouissance, a sensation of this extreme, unmodified, compelling and uncontrollable pleasure. Now, the push towards jouissance that the subject will experience throughout his whole life is effectually the Lacanian drive, and it encompasses both the life and the death forces. The drive is actually a search after this lost jouissance that was once shared with another. And this drive sustains desire by circling around its object, which will always, of course, retain its status of lostness. And the movement is the life force. Now, in its destination, of course, it is the gravitation towards death, because as it seeks a sort of going back to this born stage, to this fetal stage, it is actually going back to what had come before life. And for Lacan, what stands between the subject and the drive to reimmerse with the other, to re-achieve this primal jouissance, is actually the pleasure principle. So here is another definition of Freudian concept that is very, very different from the original meaning, because Lacan's pleasure principle, it commands enjoy, but it actually directs the subject to paths of partial satisfaction and partial enjoyment, which will never measure up to the intensities of jouissance, but will preserve the subject's life. So here you can get an idea of the way Lacan reconstrues Freudian ideas. Now, everything Lacanian is driven by absence, by what is lost and will never be refound as long as the subject is alive. And whereas desire is energetic and motivational negativity, jouissance is a positivity, a fullness and timelessness, as I said before, a lack of a lack. And Lacanian life is actually an interplay of presence and absence, desire and jouissance as it plays out with others. And within this interplay, I'll try to outline the way I read the Lacanian rendering of the mind-body relations. So desire, which, as I already explained, is the positive manifestation of absence. And Lacan says human beings have this talent of turning something absent into something positive. Like when a human being doesn't have food, and he's hungry, we say he has an appetite. Okay, or when he wants to get something that he does not have, we say he has a desire. So desire, again, the positive manifestation of absence, is actually the first marker of the subject. And moreover, it can be construed as the root of the primordial mind if we conceive of the mind as intentionality. because desire creates its object, it creates its other. And this object is not a representation of somebody. It's just a creation in the place of something that is not tangible. It's a creation aimed at plugging up what is missing. It's evoked to articulate something that is not there, that is not present. It's put in the place of something that can't be found. And the drive marks loss, and in pointing to the loss of an object, he actually propels the subject into a circuit of desire for a whole line of substitute objects that hold the promise of filling this void. And this is actually what the newborn is. He is a propelled movement, a desire that creates its objects. And intentionality here is also signification, because the object is effectually the present signifier of a signified absence. So from the point where desire is construed as actually the non-material beginnings of the incipient mind, and here we already have a beginning which is not anatomical at all, I move on to examine the relations between the mind and the organismic body that accompanies its entrance into the world. And this involves a venture into two logical moments that constitute the Lacanian subject. And I'll use feminine and masculine form throughout, but it doesn't matter because they're totally interchangeable in Lacanian development, which is the same for boys and girls. So at birth, after being exiled from inside the mother, the child still maintains an undifferentiated matrix with her. And this matrix is held together by the mother's desire for her child. Now, other psychoanalytic languages describe this state as symbiosis. And the infant, he's functionally helpless at birth. He's like a bundle of disconnected sensations, and he does not create any continuous structure from within himself. And outside of mother's orbit of desire that holds him together with her, there's only emulation and fragmentation. And inside it, the experience is, again, something that is boundless. Freud described it as oceanic, an intermixture of pleasure and pain in life and death. And in Lacanian parlance, the mother and child dwell here, recreating something of the past realm of jouissance. Now, the rare flashes of the mother's absence, they don't threaten the infant only with losing jouissance. They now mark a terrifying realm of impending death. And now, in this zone of disintegration, all of a sudden the infant is offered his mirror image. And this is the moment that any mother knows when she's holding her infant in front of the mirror, and she says to her child, "Who is that in the mirror?" And the infant sees this upright, integrated totality, and in a jubilant moment, Lacan calls it an aha moment, he identifies himself with this promising imago. And the identification with this mirror image is what creates the nucleus of the Lacanian ego. And it marks the entry into the order of visual representation, which Lacan calls the imaginary order. Now, the infant has two solid motivations for adopting the mirror image as his identity. Firstly, because this gestalt, this upright, coordinated image is by far superior to the fragmentation and helplessness of the original organismic experiencing. And secondly, this upright illusion of integrity and strength is presented to the child by the mother that he so desires, because it's usually the mother, or, when I say the other, I mean the primary caretaker. It's usually the primary caretaker that encourages the child to recognize herself in the mirror. Yeah, what a beautiful child, what a strong boy, you're going to be beautiful, just like mommy, etc. And as I said before, this mother is the closest thing to what the child has refound of his lost object, and he needs and desires her, and therefore he is very eager to be her desired object. in any way that she should signal that that object should be. That means that the first agentic force is desire, and the first focal point of existence is this desire's object. And now, in order to be the object's object, the child adopts the shape that his object, his mother, designates as his own. So what we see here is that the first experience of identity, of mental permanence, it's not given through the experience of the body, but rather by creating a body image. And this has a major mental effect, Lacan notes, because the infant's recognition of himself in the mirror image is an absurd misrecognition that involves very deep alienation, because there's a huge gulf that lies between this unified mirror image and between the infant's authentic, fragmented bodily experiencing. And moreover, this imago, this mirror image, is steeped in the other's discourse. And that means it is suffused with the other's desire. Like when the mother says, look what a beautiful baby, or look what a smart baby, or whatever it is that she's saying, she's actually articulating her desire. And this is exactly what the child takes in. So this initial me, the ego, is created by detaching from a body that we know little of. And this body is no longer understood, like in the Freudian framework is giving rise to psychic structure. Indeed, the Lacanian subject doesn't exist without an initial break from the body. He's predicated upon this break and a precondition for the response, for the recognition and information of the other. And this is what comes instead of the essential kernel, instead of a true or bodily self. We get a body image, and that was presented by somebody else, something external. And this is what we accept as our very first identity. And the experience of the body as organism is not an integral part of the subject's life at all. Actually, we can say that they exist on different sides of a seemingly unbreachable divide. Here we have the subject's evolving identity, and here we have the body experiencing that he sort of divorced. And what caused this divide is the demand of the other, and this leaves the infant cleaved and unidentical to himself. And this mirror ego is it's a fraud. It presents unity and coherence in accordance and for the sake of the other's recognition, and it's imaginary in the sense that it holds no truth or validity in relation to psychosomatic experiencing. And for Lacan, this ego is a paradigmatic representative of the imaginary order, which is an order of sense representation, especially visual representation, and in ways that resonate Kant's realm of phenomena. The imaginary consists of images that are ordered and made whole and distinct by mental operations, but they're mostly arbitrary, unknown relation to things in themselves. Actually resonates the relation between the ego and the unknown fragmented body. So the mirror stage is the first developmental moment, and the second is the Lacanian Oedipal phase, which is again very different from the Freudian one, and it also involves alienation in the sense of a break between identity and organism, between mind and body. After minding mother and identifying with the mirror image that she offered so enthusiastically, the child is again sure that he is what his mother desires. So he remains busy with how to be or not to be, or to make sure how to be her object of desire. And his success is given in her presence besides him, and this jouissance that accompanies it. And the frightening flashes of her absence are almost canceled out in the mode of the imaginary that, as I said, makes things whole and makes us ignore the cracks and everything. But as he grows, the child and mother's absence has become more frequent, and the child matures, and his perceptual apparatus matures, and as he grows older, he can no longer ignore his mother's absences. He becomes painfully aware of the fact that his desired mother comes and goes. And again, we meet the human capacity of converting absence into presence, because in the Lacanian scheme of things, the mother's absence actually drives the creation of the first signifier for the child, and the element that Lacan uses to signify the mother's absence, which is the signifier that hypothetically the child creates. He marks it as phi, which is the primitive signifier of the phallus. So this is also has a touch of irony here, because the great phallus here is unveiled as a presence that its main function is to mark an absence, to render it meaningful, to endow it with some sort of illusory materiality and then form. And as he ponders his mother's absences, the child is confronted with the dawning realization that he must not be his mother's sole object of desire, because otherwise, why would she leave his side? Mother's desire for this other object immediately makes it the child's desired object as well. He actually must have the other object that she desires. Otherwise, how can he keep his mother by his side? And gradually, the child comes to recognize the father as this other object of mother's desire. And the interesting thing here, again, is that the imaginary father, the father that is seen at home, or the Freudian castrating father, is not the father that we mean here. This father, the Lacanian father, doesn't really need to exist at all. It's what is necessary for the child's development is that the mother has desires that are additional to the desire for her child. And these desires mark her as a symbolic being, a being that is part of a social and cultural order, and that she desires and wants her identity within it. And in that sense, for the child to encounter the symbolic as something desired that exceeds the imaginary, it's more than enough for him just to encounter mother's desire to do anything that doesn't have to do with him. And that would be the symbolic father. It can be the mother's desire to get back to her job, to go back to her yoga classes, to read a book. It's anything that can signify the mother's desire to limit her jouissance with the child in order to experience a variety of pleasures and satisfactions that are unrelated to her child. And in order to emphasize that this father is the father's role is given in what he signifies, so Lacan dubs him the name of the father. That means that this father is not a person. He's rather a signifier or a construct, and he's actually what he signifies is the lawfulness itself. And only in this capacity he can rival the child and function as an object that locates and names mother's desire outside the imaginary. And then the child thinks that if mother can have this object, so he figures he can too. And if mother's desire lies in the symbolic, he will also own it. And how? In the psychoanalytic way of owning, he will identify with the name of the father, with the order that he represents, the other order. And with this identification, the child encounters and recognizes actually the larger possibilities of vicarious owning. And by this, he achieves two objectives. He still retains the illusion that he owns what he has that the mother needs and what can satisfy the mother's desire. And he can also now do so without needing to be owned by her. And this is how that he avoids the dangers that he slowly realizes that are involved in being an object of desire, such as being completely lost and obliterated in the other's desire. Now, this moment of identification with the name of the father is construed by Lacan as the moment of entry into the symbolic, and the moment that the paternal metaphor is created. And he uses the term metaphor purposely to emphasize, again, that the father's function is purely symbolic. What he is a signifier of the symbolic order that replaces the primitive maternal signifier that signified mother's absence for desire. Now, the process of substituting one signifier for the other, it's like the father's signifier pushes the mother's signifier down. It's structured like a metaphor when one term replaces another. This is actually the primal repression that marks the end of the Oedipal complex. And this primal repression creates the Lacanian unconscious. And its materials are the alienated maternal desire that, if you recall, is already given in the form of a primitive signifier. And this is the basis of Lacan's description of the unconscious being structured like a language, being the discourse of the other, because what is repressed is already a signifier. Now, the child's entry into the symbolic order marks the child's graduation from ego, which is the desired object. If you remember the mirror image that this is what he adopted in order to be the mother's object of desire. And in here, he becomes a desiring subject with his entry into the symbolic. And from now on, he will express his desire in the father's mode, which is the mode of ideas and culture and society, mostly in the medium of language. And if we try to imagine what it looks like in real life, we can say this would be the moment of transition when the child stops being the object of desire in the sense of sitting all the time on mother's lap and being cuddled and hugged all the time. And now he begins running off eagerly and ambitiously into the world to bring mother his symbolic conquests. A drawing from kindergarten, a puzzle that he has completed, or a letter that he wrote. And he still hopes and aims to receive her attention. This is why he runs to her with these symbolic achievements. And he wants her love and her pride, but not by being himself an incarnation of perfection anymore, but rather by being a knight, her knight in the symbolic, and supplying her with the goods that apparently he had already understood that she desires there. And in this world of law and language, so the child's horizons expand, he has more freedom, but this positive development does come at a price, because language precedes all individuals. It never arises from the individual. The child actually needs to bend his shape in order to express himself within language. And language can never truly accommodate physical needs. It is always a distortion. And again, it further distances the emerging, developing subject from any remnant of animal existence, of organismic existence. And actually, what happens is a reiteration and elaboration of the alienating effect of visual representation. It's like doubled in the entry into the symbolic. Every representation involves a cut from the body. And so once again, also the second moment of development, Lacan not only dissociates development from anatomy, he predicates development upon a cut from anatomy. Development doesn't unfold anatomically following some sort of phylogenetic programming like in Freud. It's driven by a desire for another. And appropriating the other's desire involves creating an identity that is twice divorced from the body. And that holds a representation that was given externally by another. First specular and then linguistic representations were given externally. And this is what we hold at the very core of our identity. So actually graduating from Oedipal development, we can say that the Lacanian subject is a tripartite entity, and he spans the three orders that he inhabits: the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real. And the real is the order that is not signified, that cannot be signified. Now, these orders always function simultaneously with all sorts of complex synchronizations between them. And in the symbolic, we can say that the subject exists as a subject of the unconscious. He's comprised of signifiers. He answers to the law, to linguistic, cultural, social roles and norms. In the imaginary order, the subject exists as ego, which is actually his conscious self. And the subject of the third order, the real, exists as that part of experience that evades all representation, all meaning, all signification, whether it is specular or linguistic. And the real, it is always experienced as uncanny, as traumatic, as uncontrollable. And the self is never recognizable in the real, because what we have of ourselves, of our known selves, are those representations that we know and that we understand. So actually, if we encounter ourselves in the real, it is always a collapse in the sense of self. And the real can also be conceived as this mythical existence that predates the signifier, this primordial strata that holds and resonates the primal sensation of jouissance in the unification with the mother, and also the turbulence and fragmentation of organismic experiencing that had actually been divorced. And the body also, like the subject himself, it's also a tripartite structure across the three orders. The imaginary body is sort of body formation. It gives us, satisfies the need for envelope, for container. It differentiates inside from outside. It insulates, it protects, it leaves behind the original experience of fragmentation. The symbolic body is a body that is tamed and dominated by the other as culture, language, and law. This is a socialized body. It's structured by cultural practices. It resonates Foucault's discipline. And the body of the real is always unknown. It's akin to the lost, fragmented body that we had divorced. And it's revealed only when the imaginary or symbolic coordinates are actually thrown into question, like when something strange and unfamiliar appears in the skin or in a person's posture. So we're immediately thrown off balance, and sometimes injury brings about such a desymbolization of the body, making it feel alien. So actually, ironically, only in its foreignness, the cultivated body becomes organic to the subject. And the body of the real is also given in jouissance. And when assuming identity in imaginary and symbolic dimensions, so we actually give up this jouissance, it's evacuated to the margins of the body. Actually, those margins that create the classical Freudian eretogenic zones, the oral, anal, and genital, which are also our points of connection with the other. So Freud understood their formation as part of an epigenetic program development of the drive, and Lacan sees them as vestiges of jouissance that were disciplined in accordance with the demand of the other. Like if for some reason the elbow had some sort of very meaningful social meaning that the mother would emphasize all the time, this would become an erotogenic zone, if we think in Lacanian. So at the end of this journey, where actually do we find ourselves? So just to recap shortly, to pull it all together. So we define desire as the primal determining force of the individual mind in the Lacanian universe, and that we said that the break from the mother at birth creates an absence, a lack, which is the essential core of the subject that manifests its desire. The desire creates its object, and this simultaneously constitutes the mind as intentionality and also gives its first signification. And here on, actually, body-mind relations, they just follow intersubjective imperatives. And what these intersubjective imperatives do is that they introduce very deep rifts between body and mind. And the newborn's initial desire is for mother's presence. It's what keeps him alive. It what revives something of the jouissance that was lost at birth. But it is exactly this desire for the mother that drives him to identify with the mirror image, which is divorced from the body experiencing, and the same desire for the other is what drives his entry into the symbolic. And again, linguistic representation further distances him from his organistic experience. So actually what we have is the core existence of lack that is twice divorced from its bodily counterpart. And it seems that like until the 70s, Lacan was fairly satisfied with the subject of, that he created. But from that point on, we begin to see a sort of retrograde gravitation back to the early organismic body that was left behind in the process of creating an identity. And if we want to follow how it works, so we can look at it through the prism of the concept of jouissance. Until the 20th seminar, which is a seminar, it's called Encore, and it's about love. Until then, Lacan's construal of jouissance was fairly straightforward. It was lost at birth. It was lost again with the subject's entry into the symbolic. The symbolic marked its lawful limits, its strictly regulated paths of satisfaction. And in Seminar 20, this familiar jouissance is now dubbed phallic jouissance. And it marks it as a jouissance that is allowed by the law, defined in relation to the name of the father. And phallic jouissance is actually the jouissance that is found both in speech and within accepted norms. And before phallic jouissance, as I sort of repeated a few times, we have this mythic, retroactively experienced jouissance, and the pre-symbolic jouissance that was related to the mother's body, to her desire, and to being the object of this desire. And this is a jouissance that exists only as lost. And in the 20th seminar, Lacan defines a third jouissance, and he calls it feminine jouissance. And this jouissance lies beyond the signifier. And what actually happens with this jouissance is it exceeds the rules and the regulations of symbolic law. And it signals the possibility of replacing the name of the father with any other anchorage that can hold together a lawful order in any particular and individual way, and that can create very particular and highly personal modes of jouissance that are not wholly governed by the phallic social order. So just notice for a second how the assignment of gender, of masculine and feminine, is completely consistent with Lacan's de-emphasis of anatomy, because the phallic is what is within the limits of the law of the father. The feminine is what exceeds it. It has nothing to do with anatomy. Now, the character of feminine jouissance can be illuminated by two additional binaries, which is truth and knowledge, and thought and being. And Lacan's initial emphasis on the symbolic set great store on knowledge, on thought, and generally on rule-governed modes. And progressively throughout his writings, Lacanian truth becomes a mode of being that is divorced from knowledge and thought. Knowledge no longer has a privileged status, and both truth and being increasingly become integrated into the order of the real, and their flashes of manifestation become highly particular. So the feminine that diverges from the law of the father anchors truth and being in a radically different way of thinking, knowing, and existing. And this particularization through feminine jouissance is actually Lacan's way of wresting the subject from complete subjection to the signifier and to the law. So feminine jouissance is like Bian's like any jouissance, it can be experienced, but it can never become known. And it can't be formalized or inscribed, neither in the realm of the law or the signifier. And this positioning in the real links the feminine jouissance with the twilight zone of the pre-symbolic. And in both areas, the unknown sensations of the organismic body become increasingly important. And alongside this new formulation of jouissance, Lacan also begins to articulate a new dimension of the unconscious. And up till now, he described the unconscious mostly in linguistic terms, structured like a language, discourse of the other. And in Seminar 20, he begins to describe it differently. And it's we can look at it as another dimension of the unconscious. And here he says the real is the mystery of the speaking body, the mystery of the unconscious, creating an equation between the speaking body and the unconscious. And the mystery of the speaking body is effectively its jouissance. It's the mode in which the body experiences and enjoys itself. And actually, what we see is that the linguistic aspect of the unconscious begins to give way to jouissance. And in the same way, the other, as an anchorage of identity, begins to give way to the body. Because if until now the subject we knew had twice divorced his bodily experiencing, now we are refinding a particular and highly unmodified bodily dimension in the very innermost being of this subject. And in the later seminars, Lacan further elaborates this real dimension of the unconscious. And its main characteristic is that it's unrelated to meaning. And it actually emerges from what Lacan describes as a copulation of language with the body. And this copulation is a bodily event, and it's given and recorded in some sort of corporeal hieroglyphics of jouissance. And it involves a primal encounter between language and bodies. And it's actually an accidental meeting between bodily substance and vocalization, the sound, the rhythm, the relation of the other's speech. And it takes place before any logic is in place, both imaginary and linguistic. And Lacan's term for this melodious vocalization is la langue. And this unconscious, Lacan says, is a knowledge articulated by la langue, by a body held together by the real that it enjoys. So here we find a formulation of the body that is held together not by the mirror image, not by socialization, but rather by the real jouissance that it enjoys. And if formerly we knew lawful phallic jouissance and imagined the primal jouissance given in the mother-infant merger, we now find jouissance as an effect of la langue, sort of a bodily inscription of the phrasing, the rhyming, the breathing that accompanied the parents' discourse. And this jouissance affects the body in ways that are devoid of meaning. It's a contingent, unique encounter between speaking and spoken to bodies, and it creates particular patterns of jouissance to particular bodies. And the knowledge of these patterns is inscribed in the real unconscious. That means that it precedes any meaning and any distinction of signifier and signified. It is held in what Lacan calls a letter. A letter does not fall in together with other letters like the signifiers fall in together to create meaning. Letter stands alone, and it is rather a thing that is enjoyed in and for itself. it carries no meaning other than holding jouissance, and it is enjoyed in bodily ways and we can think of it in ways that resonates Freud's articulation of the kernel of the dream, for example, or a kernel of a symptom, that we know that the symptom has this symbolic envelope that can be interpreted away, but even after we get through this symbolic envelope, we're often left with this core of the symptom. And Lacan would say this is the letter that holds the jouissance, and we know already from Freud that the symptoms are enjoyed, and this kernel, this core of the symptom, actually holds a jouissance that what the subject needs to do is actually, if he is inclined to do so, is to accept this jouissance and actually to learn how to work it, to learn the know-how of managing it. And this management of the jouissance actually is what will constitute what Lacan calls the symptome. The symptome is, we can look at it as an evolution of the symptom that will now hold together the possibilities of jouissance in a different way. It will involve the ability to get to know this jouissance, to get to know how to work it, and to accept its singularity, to accept its divergence from the symbolic, and actually also to accept the possibility to be defined in a singular way that is not part of the norm, part of the law, part of the Oedipal law, and entails a willingness to know oneself in a very individual, particular way that must go through the body. And for Lacan, this is actually what happens in analysis, that the subject of analysis is presented with a choice. If formerly he had sought and formulated his symbolic and imaginary identity by conforming with the other, in analysis he encounters a chance to identify himself, to find himself in terms of the body as an other, in terms of some sort of bodily contingency that is wholly his own and is given in a very highly particular economy of jouissance. And his identification with this kernel of jouissance is what Lacan will call the finding of his private, particular, secret name that can actually replace the name of the father. So in Lacanian thought, this symptom turned symptome demonstrates the jouissance of the bodily subject that holds this singularity that doesn't conform and also reforges the mind-body connection that had formerly been given up by the subject twice. So that is actually giving the whole story, and I hope you were able in some ways to follow and somehow to give an alternative picture of how the mind and the body come together in a way that that always must go through another, and it has no way has no way around it, must go through the other.
Thank you. So that's such a rich presentation. I'm very excited about what you said. I got lots of ideas. I don't want to hold myself back too much, so I'll just start. The second half of what you said maps almost perfectly onto Jungian ideas about midlife and orientation to the self, which is about singularity. And that, because when you started talking about the shift in Lacan, I wondered, how that was related to his aging and to a kind of midlife transition. And what you've described sort of resonates point for point almost with Jungian ideas of midlife and after, when you become oriented around the self. So I found that very exciting to feel that connection and to want to explore it and explicate it more. Because there are features of earlier ideas he has which I find a bit peculiar to deal with. But in terms of the long trajectory, it does be very similar to notions of individuation and so on. And just one thing that did strike me was where you were speaking about the other as the third thing, right? There's the body, the mind, and the other. I mean, that seemed to me to be very similar to Jung's idea of the self. The self is this, in a way, third thing that has a kind of interplay with body and mind, and has cultural story to it and all that. Anyway, that's sort of some of my excitement.
I am not well versed in Jungian thought, but I will say something about what I think motivated Lacan's turn, in a way, his turn towards the real and towards the body. I doubt, it may very well be that it had to do with his age, but if I follow some sort of inner logic in his development, I think it has more to do with a sort of radical freedom that Lacan is all the time searching for. And that would be one thing. And the other would be a state of refusing something that will be all encompassing and uniform. And I think that when Lacan began writing, he began writing at a time when ego psychology was going very strong, and he actually saw the whole area of ego psychology is dealing with the imaginary, and as leaving Freud's original emphasis on language. And his move into the symbolic was part of his rebellion against the emphasis on the ego, on the conscious parts of the personality, and his emphasis on an alterity that is within us and that can never be ignored, and that has a productive force, and that always leaves us divided, all the time leaves us divided. And you can see all the time he talks about divisions in the subject. He has a sort of commitment to go against anything that reaches a whole structure. I think this objection is an ethical one. He actually saw anything whole as very, very dangerous. he saw it as lying at the root of very dangerous ideologies, at the root of omnipotence, anything that. So he when he was moving from the imaginary to the symbolic, he thought he was moving from a mode of representation that was a one-on-one representation and that was very captivating and sticky, to a realm of thirdness that involved much more liberty of self-definition, of definition at large, which is always by definition pluralistic, holds many meanings, many possibilities of definition. But then what happened is that with his emphasis on the symbolic, he found himself trapped now in the Oedipal law. And for Lacan, law, its main characteristic is that it's arbitrary. Any law can be the Oedipal law, as long as it's lawful, okay? But it doesn't have any inherent anchoring, any essential anchoring, not in the self, not in God, nowhere, doesn't, okay? So his symbolic subject, I think he ended up with a subject that he found himself again subjected for his liking, and in trying to extricate him from the symbolic, he closed the circle into the real. That's how I think it evolved. I always imagine, because I don't know, Jung as sort of reaching towards some sort of, I would say, I don't know, an inner peace and some sort of, I don't know if wholeness would be the word, but Lacan would never allow that.
Well, I mean, Jung says, any encounter with the self is a defeat for the ego. So that's like quite a Lacanian statement.
Definitely, very much so.
Yeah.
Barbara.
Okay. Am I on?
We're on.
I'm on. Okay. I'm going to follow through with what Dave is saying about the connection with Jung, that I'm also finding very exciting. So when you're talking, you say this wresting the subject from complete subjection to the other, and you're also talking about an increase in freedom. That to me works well with how Jung talks about the complex, and also this whole way of becoming caught in complexes early on, and if we're lucky, we can find our way. That we're maybe I'm just wondering, I'm playing with this idea of the real as possibly the uncomplexed life that is possible. So that's my little bit.
And that sounds amazing in the sense, I'm not versed in Jungian language, so you'll have to tell me if I'm getting you right here. But if I understand, the complex is some sort of pre-given structure or form that, no, it's not.
No, it's what you've been describing about things being formed.
Right. So once it's formed, it's called a complex.
Yeah.
Right.
It gathers.
Yes. And I think so. It's so very, I think it would very much be that the real would be an uncomplexed, I don't know, zone. But tell me, for Jung, this uncomplexed zone, how would you find your way in it? Would it have any inherent meanings or significations?
Well, it's a very, you hardly get there. Let's put it that way. Like what you're saying, and what I think you're saying about the real reminds me also what Jung was also very close to the Taoistic formulations, and the Taos, they say that the Tao that you can name is not the Tao.
Exactly.
So
this would very much echo saying, Lacan saying that the word kills the thing.
Yeah.
The minute you name the Tao is already not there.
It's not the
anymore. This is very interesting for me because not knowing Jung, I had always noticed the similarities between Lacan and Bion.
Right.
And I was thinking many times of Bion's O as somehow resonating the real, and the K
Yeah. That
falling in
works.
with.
I think that
Yeah.
works very well. Yes. Yeah.
So it's interesting for me that Jung, you're actually also saying it was looking for ways to extricate the subject from forms in which he had been captivated.
Yes, for sure. For sure.
And thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks for a brilliant lecture, Shlomit. I'm, I've struggled with understanding Lacan for, I don't know, at least 25 years probably. And when I listen to people lecture, they tend to have entirely different interpretations at times. I mean, they're interesting interpretations, and I think it underscores the contradictory nature of his entire philosophy. And that just listening for this hour here, it's like we're confronted with one contradiction that's overcoming another, that's operating in a cycle, in a circular way, and they play off each order, so to speak, plays off the other. And so maybe you can help me understand. My interpretation is that for Lacan, he doesn't have a good theory of agency. He doesn't have a theory of freedom. Everything for him is outside of the subject. It's the environment, the language, the symbolic order, even desire itself is foreign. It's not owned, and it's incorporated, but it never has a center that stems from within. And then the other thing is that he privileges the outside. He privileges a kind of environmental determinism, so to speak. So how do you get some kind of theory of freedom from Lacan or agency or whatever, if it can be salvaged?
First of all, I think it is totally accurate to say that externality is given precedence. We are born into language, we are born into culture, we are born into the dream of the other, we are born into identifications that trap us. And I would say that the answer to a theory of freedom would be given in the concept of transcendence, and in the concept of, let me think how you say this in English, violation, of transcendence and of violation, that the subject finds himself in the moments that he does not obey, that he is not a subject. This is how the tension in Lacan is given between being a subject and subjectification. And language is given and the rules are given. If I can make of it something that is my own, it may very well be that I will violate certain normative modes. And I would say that this pertains not only to the use of language, it pertains to how I define myself gender-wise, how I define myself as a woman, how I define myself as an Israeli, how I define myself as anything. There would be the norm, and there would be where I stand in relation to it. and how my actions define me. And in this way, I think it is very true that the Lacanian subject is also a very political subject. He is there's no inside and outside in Lacan. Okay, and this would be very different from let's say from a Cartesian perspective or Freudian perspective. The orders, they sort of encompass everything that makes psychic reality, but the big other is also inside me and he's also outside me. My unconscious is what my parents dreamt me to be. What lies in my unconscious is what my mother hoped for when she was pregnant. And what lies in my unconscious is what came through to me, if it was her happiness or her sadness or her despair or her pain when she sang me to sleep. This is what lies in the deepest recesses of my unconscious. And my way of coming to terms with this, and maybe in what like Barbara said, of transcending the structured complex parts, Lacan would just call them, I think, identifications, yeah, transcending them. Those moments would be moments of freedom, but it's true that for Lacan, the subject, he's a fleeting appearance, yeah, and in a way, this makes you ethically much more responsible because you are apt to disappear. This is a very, I would say, a very Heideggerian idea. You, if you do not pay attention, you always fall prey. You're always das Man. Being something else is always a matter of responsibility. There is no meaning, there is no self to anchor you. It is only up to you. And it is very easy to lose hold of and to implode into your identifications, or to sort of melt into imperatives that are outside. But the agency is given in resistance. Resistance is actually the name of the game, I would say.
So, just so I understand, we know Lacan attended lectures on Hegel. We know he read Heidegger. So the notion of thrownness and historicity would be part of how he's incorporated that philosophy. We know that he's taken over the notion of desire and lack from Hegel. Yeah, through Khrushchev. And so you've got two things going on that are operating simultaneously. But to get back to the mind-body problem, it almost seemed like your lecture was really kind of highlighting a dualism, an ontological dualism, that not a monism where all three parts are connected. It almost felt like to me that he's saying we dissociate from our bodies. The specter of the image is always out there, but from from a theory of mind, we know that it's emanating from within psyche, and our psyches are embodied and ensouled. And so maybe you can help me find that connection between those two realms.
But so I just want to make one thing that I did not bring forth clearly enough, probably, is that the three orders, they always exist simultaneously. I introduce them separately, and I can give them a phenomenological description separately, and the entrance into the order has its moment, but always they exist together. If they fall apart, it is a psychotic collapse, and they are held together by the name of the father, by the symptom. It depends on where you catch Lacan. Sometimes it's just sort of an interconnectedness of a link that holds them together, but always, always, always they are held together. And and the dissociation that Lacan talks about is an experiential one. Okay, I dissociate from my organismic body because I want to be the object of the other's desire. This does not mean that my organismic body is not there. Okay, it is always there. And the moment, and there might be all sorts of traumatic moments that I will discover it. Just like, when even sometimes when, God forbid, in accidents or when we're injured and all of a sudden you see the inside of your body and you're totally shot. We don't live with this experience of what our organism is, knowing that we are embodied and always embodied. We do not live with this consciousness. If we did, it would probably, I think it would be a very, to evolve in a way that really integrates this sort of experiencing is quite a feat, I would say. But it is always there. It is always, always, always there. All of them.
We also know that he hung out with a bunch of, avant-garde intellectuals, Merleau-Ponty, Sartre, Bataille, a number of artists and such. And they were writing on imagination, and Merleau-Ponty was writing on perception.
Yeah.
So do you think that he was like taking the opposite kind of angle that prefaces, let's say, consciousness and embodiment?
It's interesting that what you're saying, because I can see how the whole existentialist goes to the consciousness, but I also think that what they have very much in common is that the existentialists were trying to get rid of essentialism, and by saying that the experience is before anything essential, that they were going in the same direction, and I think that he found very. I think that if we think about it, about Merleau-Ponty and Merleau-Ponty's emphasis, like his difference between speaking language and spoken language, Lacan's full speech and empty speech. If you think about Merleau-Ponty's continuum between gesture and speech, I would say that Lacan was actually in his late seminars was actually going, I would say, very much in a Merleau-Ponty direction. He was looking very much for an experience of a body that knowledge is not meanings, significations. We're in a different realm that really goes to the experience of the body. So I think he was making his way back there, and his point of departure, what he wanted to divorce actually, was Freud's essential Cartesian base. He didn't want a subject based on anatomy, because we're talking here post World War II. We're talking about the collapse of any modern philosophy into terrible catastrophes, and Lacan was actually part of the articulation of the postmodern ethos, and he wanted a psychoanalytic subject that would not be bound to maternity. He wanted a psychoanalytic subject that gives priority to the other. But maybe he actually what happened to him was what happened to Levinas. What we can see happened to Levinas at the end, that giving the other the priority it does not actually solve your problem at the end if you're really looking for an intersubjective encounter. So at the end, he was looking for something to balance this great weight of the other, and he didn't find it in the body. But this body, by that time, was experienced as an other.
Thanks so much. That was great.
I'm so glad I understood your questions. I'm still hoping that I understood them.
Yeah, for me, it was also very interesting, the analogy to Jung, because 50 years ago, I was a devout reader of Jung. So I think the way that you portray the whole process as a process of individuation is really reminiscent of Jung, also in the sense that there is in Jung also a double negation in which, first of all, you have to recognize and identify the collective element in your being and then extricate yourself from it, which is really quite similar to there is an analogy to what you have described as evolving from imaginary to symbolic and then negating the symbolic through the puncturing by the real. Yeah, so that's one thing that I was happy to rediscover. Another is really that after I was a devout reader of Jung, I became a devout reader of Karl Marx, and here I think the analogy is even more striking because there is what Marx liked to describe as turning upside down the Hegelian scheme of development from pure spirit to negation or alienation in the material, and then a double negation back into which acquires a certain wholeness. But the difference is, first of all, like Marx, you start from a unity that is a bodily unity in two senses. One is that the baby experiences its own bodiness, and in an attempt to do something to remain the object of desire, which elevates him from his bodiness, he creates something else. He creates, it's an alienating process. From what? From a material existence, which is like what Marx tried to do as well, especially the young Marx, I think, but also later on. And then there is another negation of this process that the real is promoting by puncturing symbolic existence. So I think there is a double negation of the kind that you see in Marx in response to Hegel, right? As turning Hegel upside down, like instead of a transcendental spirituality, as in Hegel, it's a transcendental materiality, like in Marx. But I think the difference for Marx, which is very important, that for Marx there is a certain, especially the older Marx, there is a certain unity in the end, which you don't see in your Lacanian developmental scheme, because the real, the body punctured, keeps puncturing this, I mean, spoiling the law, spoiling the order, spoiling the symbolic, not allowing unification. Unification is always oppressive. And in that sense, yeah, in that sense, there is a difference here. There are analogies with Marx that are really remarkable for me in your story. But the end is, I think, is a lot more democratic than Marx's. The body doesn't regain unity. It only it comes into action, but by puncturing the law.
Definitely.
Thank you so much for a wonderful discussion, a wonderful talk. Great questions. We appreciate the effort you put in.
Thank you. And thank you for all I learned about you. Thanks, Barbara. And thanks, David. This was great with the ego and the self.
Okay, bye-bye.
Right.